Welcome to episode 5 of the Going for Broke Outdoors podcast, a podcast by an outdoorsman for other outdoorsmen. I'm your host, Jeremy Gillespie. In today's episode, we talk with Penn State University research wildlife biologist Duane Diefenbach. Dwayne works for the U.S. Geological Survey. Part of Dwayne's responsibilities include running a GPS collar study of whitetailed deer. Dwayne's primary research interests focus on empirically evaluating models used to estimate population parameters and how those models are incorporated into management decisions. Consequently, many of his research projects involve game species, for example, white-tailed deer, black bear, and wild turkey. His research is focused on methods of estimating abundance as well as hunter attitudes and behavior and how that influences harvest rates and the spatial distribution of hunter harvest. In today's episode, Duane and I discuss deer capture methods, deer home ranges and how they evolve during the course of the hunting season, how deer respond to hunter pressure during Pennsylvania's rifle season, nocturnal bucks, how temperature, wind, and rain affect deer movement, adult buck survival rates on public lands, aging deer on the hoof, and the impact of chronic wasting disease. If you enjoy the podcast, I'd appreciate it if you give the video a like, subscribe to my YouTube channel, or share the podcast with a friend. I'm also excited to announce my second giveaway. When my YouTube channel hits 500 subscribers, I'm going to give away 2 prizes. First, a $100 gift card to Cabela's, and the second prize has been donated by Stealth Outdoors and will include a set of stealth strips for climbing sticks, a tree stand kit, and a roll of stealth strips to silence your entire setup. To enter the giveaway, visit the contact page on my website and sign up for my subscriber list. There's a link in the description of this video. Second, go to the Stealth Outdoors Facebook or Instagram pages and give them a like, and you'll be entered for the giveaway. Today's podcast is brought to you by Stealth Outdoors, the tree stand silencing store. Stealth Outdoors manufactures a variety of tree stand silencing equipment aimed at the mobile hunter, including climbing stick wraps, cam buckle covers, platform cable wraps, and more. Head over to www.stealthoutdoors.com to check out the latest addition to the product line, Smoke Camo, a unique open pattern camo designed specifically to camouflage and conceal your tree stand at elevation. Today's podcast is also brought to you by Snark Media Agency, a digital-first agency focused on custom web design, specialized photo and video creation, and all things marketing. Visit www.snarkmediaagency.com to establish or expand your online presence. Web, photo, video, Snark Media Agency. All right, today I'm joined by Duane Diefenbach. Duane, I'm real excited to talk to you because I feel like a lot of hunter knowledge of whitetail behavior is based on folklore, anecdotes, and campfire stories. However, I am a data guy. I love data. I actually tutored business statistics in college, and now I work in a profession where one of my primary responsibilities is data analysis. So show me the data and an acceptable sample size, and I'll be a believer. So Dwayne, thanks for joining me today. And how's life been treating you in the crazy times of 2020?
Well, fortunately, I've been doing very well. It's working from home and learning how to commute upstairs to my new office. So I really can't complain. And my family's good, too.
Oh, that's good to hear. I'm also on the work from home program right now, and I'm enjoying that. The commute's a lot better and the wardrobe's a lot less restrictive.
Yeah, it certainly is.
So Duane, for people who aren't familiar with you and your work, let's start with how, why, and when did you get interested in white-tailed deer enough to devote your professional life to it?
Well, it all started when I took my current position as working at the Pennsylvania Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. I guess that it's going to take a minute to explain, but most people don't know that the co-op units, as they're called, were actually created back in the 1930s. The first one is at Iowa State University, and they're truly a cooperative of the State Wildlife Agency. Currently, it's the U.S. Geological Survey, which is my employer, the federal government, and land-grant universities. The co-op units were created because back in the 30s, there wasn't even the word wildlife, and they needed to train professionals for this new profession of managing wildlife for the benefit of all. So I took this position in Pennsylvania. The co-op unit was created there in 1938. Of course, I didn't start in 38. I started in 1999. And at that time, the Pennsylvania Game Commission, which is one of our cooperators, was interested in initiating some white-tailed deer research. So, of course, I was engaged, being a research scientist, engaged in that effort, and the Game Commission has been funding white-tailed deer research since that time. So basically about 20 years now. So I just kind of fell into it because of my position. To be honest with you, I never would have picked research in white-tailed deer as a career focus, but the Game Commission has put a lot of resources towards the research that I've done over the past 20 years, so it's been really satisfying. We've done a lot of nice work, large-scale experiments that really have shed a lot of insights on white-tailed deer ecology and management.
Oh, great. That's a great introduction. And also for the people that are listening, can you kind of give a rundown of your education? And it sounds like you already talked about you've got 20 years experience just with white-tailed deer, but maybe what you did prior to that and what your degree focuses.
Sure. Well, I grew up in Vermont. I did my undergraduate work in wildlife biology at Washington State University. And then I did a master's degree at the University of Maine, studying black ducks and wetland habitats in south central Maine. After my master's degree, I went to the University of Georgia, and for my PhD research, I reintroduced bobcats to an island off the coast of Georgia. In fact, I'm still doing some research down there, which, kind of funny, actually has a link to deer, because we've shown that bobcats have had a big impact on the island deer down there. So I've been almost all over the country. I figured after I finished my PhD, I'd end up in the southwestern U.S., but came back after my PhD to Pennsylvania, and I actually worked for the Pennsylvania Game Commission for 7 years as their biometrician, and then took this position here at Penn State in the co-op unit.
Yeah, so it sounds like you've got a long history in biology and a lot of experience, and that's why, a big part of the reason I was so excited to talk to you in the 20 years of research that you have done. So one of the other things I wanted to ask about is curious, you're a biologist and you're studying a lot of different wildlife. Are you also a hunter?
Yeah, I'm a hunter. My dad took me bird hunting when I was like 2 years old, and my mom wasn't too happy about it, but he'd sit me on a rock and go walk through the coverts and come back and pick me up afterwards. And I've hunted deer since I was 11 years old, but my real passion is upland game bird hunting. Here in Pennsylvania, it's grouse and woodcock, and I've gone out west to hunt prairie grouse, and I've got bird dogs. So I still deer hunt every year. I love to put some venison in the freezer, but my real passion is bird hunting with bird dogs.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I'm all about deer, but I imagine doing it day in and day out of varieties, the spice of life, is probably nice to do something else in your free time.
Yeah, well, deer hunting is completely different from research, but I don't know, there's just something about bird hunting that trips my trigger, I guess. I can't explain why it is that bird hunting is my passion, but it is. It is what it is.
Yeah, coming from the Midwest where I did mostly tree stand or stationary blind hunting, and then coming out west to more spot and stalk, there's definitely something to be said for moving around while you're hunting. So I think that, to me, the few times I've done upland bird hunting, that's definitely the appeal, is get out and get some exercise and fresh air and not necessarily just sitting there freezing to death.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's move into some of the methods that you and your team are using to capture deer and fit the collars. So could you talk about, I know there's a couple different methods, could you talk about how you're getting these deer in the first place to collar and tag them?
Yeah, so here in Pennsylvania, we've tried lots of different techniques and have settled on basically two or three as the most effective. We use what are called clover traps, and they're not what you think. You'd think that that means they're baited with clover, but in fact, they're named after the guy who designed the first trap. And his last name was Clover. So we use clover traps. They're basically just a big walk-in trap that we bait with corn, shelled corn, and they trip a trigger that causes a door to slide down behind them. And those are probably our most effective because we can move them around. We set them up and just have to check them every day, make sure they're baited, find areas where there's a lot of deer activity. And of course, we just capture the deer January through March, sometimes into April if it's a really late spring. But the clover traps are really effective because they're easy to use, and we can have a whole trap line set up. The other technique that we use, probably well, it depends on the habitats we're in, but the second most common, I guess I'd say, would be what we call a rocket net. That's what is it? It's about 30 by 60 foot square net, and you actually, you attach three or four rockets to it. When you detonate those rockets, they shoot the net out over the deer. So it's a pretty exciting way to catch deer, and it can be effective. I mean, you can catch 4 or 5 deer. You just have to make sure that you have enough people on hand to control the deer once they're in the net. The drawback is that when you catch a deer in the rocket net, you have to sedate them because they get all tangled up, and you usually caught 4 or 5 deer at once. So it takes a while to process them, and so you have to sedate them because deer, if they're stressed and held in captivity too long, get what's called capture myopathy. And we don't really completely understand what happens, but basically the animals are stressed, their muscles are tense, and lactic acid builds up, and it actually can start breaking down muscle tissue. So, but if you can sedate them, you don't have any problems with that. So that's our second most common technique. And then we also have used what we call drop nets. And these are really big nets. Oh, boy, they're probably 90 feet on a side, square, big metal posts that hold them up. We have a special remote-controlled trigger mechanism. So basically you bait the middle of underneath the net and get deer used to walking in there and feeding on the bait. And then the night that you're going to trap, you get a crew of people, the deer come in, and you drop the net. And so you can catch a lot of deer at once with that. The only problem is you're not going to move that trap very often because it takes several hours to set it up, and it's heavy, and you could spend a day, 4 people taking down a net, moving it, and setting up in a new place. So you have a big investment in the establishment of the trap, whereas the clover trap, 2 people can move it. You just throw it in the back of a truck or on a trailer, and then when you do catch deer, you can, when our crews get real well trained and have a lot of experience handling deer, they can run in, tackle that deer and restrain it, collect all the data that we need to collect, ear tag it, and put a radio collar on in under 10 minutes. So with the clover traps, you don't have to sedate the animal. It's a very short handling time, and they're easy to move. So that, really is the preferred capture method. We've tried other. We actually, when we first started, it was in 2002. There was a helicopter crew that was up in New Hampshire catching moose, and they were coming back through Pennsylvania, and we hired them to capture some deer with the helicopters out in western PA. And the problem in Pennsylvania is that our trees are just so tall. I mean, 120-foot oak tree, is not uncommon. And so the deer, the helicopter just can't get down low enough to flush out the deer. And the other problem is helicopters can cover a large area, and we just can't get enough permission from enough landowners to make it effective to say, okay, you've got, this area to catch deer. The helicopter is just not an effective tool, but out west, where you are in Montana and many of the western states, the helicopters are extremely effective. I mean, I've seen in Texas where they can catch enough deer in 2 days that would take us 4 months in Pennsylvania.
Oh, with helicopter nets, huh?
Yep.
Well, one other thing I wanted to talk about, and it's going back to the clover trap. So in preparation for this podcast here, I reviewed almost the entire Penn State University deer blog, which I'd highly recommend to anyone listening. Go ahead to PSU deer blog and check that out. But it appears in the clover traps, as you kind of alluded to, there's a little bit of deer wrestling that occurs when you're getting in the trap and applying the radio collar and taking whatever data or samples that you're taking. So you have any entertaining stories about interns wrestling deer?
Yes, it's a job for young people. It's exciting. So our crews wear, of course, it's winter time, so they probably have Carhartts on, so they're pretty well padded as it is. But they have to wear hockey masks. The hooves on deer are extremely sharp, and so they need face protection. So hockey masks work really well. So the crews, usually there's at least 2 or 3 people, and so one person is going to dive into that trap, and the other person runs up with them and helps them open the trap door, and then that person with the helmet goes in and tackles the deer. That's all well and good, except usually in late March things get kind of warm, and inside that trap you can have a soupy mess of 3 or 4 inches of mud on the bottom, and it can be a pretty disgusting mess by the time wrestling a deer. The other excitement that comes is, even though we're catching deer in wintertime, some bucks still have antlers, and that's particularly dangerous, or can be dangerous. So we have a different strategy where we have, we call it a purse net. It's just some netting that instead of going into the trap and trying to tackle this deer that has antlers that can be quite dangerous, what we do is get 3 or 4 people that hold that net, and then they open the door and scare the deer into the net, and the deer gets tangled in the net, and then we can tackle it. And of course, one of the first things we do is saw the antlers off, so that no one gets injured. And so that's usually entertaining. If it's a big deer, people are going to get dragged a little bit and maybe knock heads together trying to keep this deer in place. I guess it's sort of funny, but it's kind of a bummer because it's a lot of effort catching a deer. But we have had crews where the deer comes flying out of the trap and the netting just tears and the deer's gone. We figure it costs us about $1,000 per deer, because we're talking, equipment. Well, not really the capital expense of the equipment, but you've got mostly personnel time, some baiting, and some certain supplies and such. So it's expensive to catch a deer, and we hate to see when, we hate to lose one, but it happens occasionally. Nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, sure. No, that's pretty interesting, and it kind of reminds me. I worked on a dairy farm in high school, and then I have a buddy here in Montana that is a rancher, and it sounds a lot like branding, cattle and calves in the spring, and yeah, they can be pretty rowdy. So I want to move into talking about bucks in the study specifically. And one of the things that I read is that I believe all, but correct me if I'm wrong, all the bucks are 2.5 years old or older going into the deer season. And this podcast is focused primarily on deer hunting, and most people are hunting bucks. So could you talk about why that is and what the advantage is to the research of collaring these 2.5-year-old or older bucks?
The reason we only collared adult bucks or adult deer is if we were to collar, so when we're trapping in January through March, fawns would be, 8 months old or so. And then, of course, the other deer would be 1 year, 8 months. And so by June, they would either be 1 or 2 years old, the youngest deer. Well, the problem with the ones that are less than a year old is that the males in the spring and early fall are going to disperse. And so most of those young bucks, 75% of those young bucks, are probably going to leave our study area. So it's not worth putting a $2,500 GPS collar on a deer that's going to leave your study area. So that's why we focus on the older deer, because we know that when we collar them, they'll remain on our study area and allow us to get the data that we need relevant to the project. That's really the only reason. Well, another reason is that fitting radio collars to younger deer can be problematic because they end up growing, and fitting a collar to a deer is as much art as it is science. And it's much more difficult with those younger deer because you have to accommodate for growth, and you don't necessarily know how big they're going to get. So it's just a lot easier to deal with adult deer.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. So appreciate you providing that information. And it's kind of got the added benefit for my audience where most of the guys that are listening to my podcast are probably targeting 2.5-year-old or older or bucks, trying to get something with a little more developed body and rack. So it's I guess
right.
a good side benefit for the listeners here. Well, let's talk about the collars themselves real quick. How often are these collars transmitting the deer's location data to you and your staff?
Well, the collars we use are a GPS collar, but they also have a satellite link. So we can communicate with those collars. So we can send commands to the collars. Those collars then send data back to us. And we actually change the rate at which we get data. So the limiting factor with how much data you can get from a deer is how big a battery can you put on it. And so a lot of the deer in our study areas can live for 3 years or more. And so we have to be very careful about how many locations per day, because the more locations we get, the more it uses up battery life.
Okay.
And so for most of the year, we're getting, a location every 7 hours. And that way it's an odd number, and it just kind of rotates through the day. So we get a good picture of where they are at all different times of day, but we're not getting real intensive locations. Usually what we do is it depends on the focus of our research, but usually what we've been doing is in September, late September, switch over to a location every hour. But there's other times where we need locations like every 20 minutes. So it's really variable. It depends on what the objectives of our research is and how long we need those collars to stay on and that sort of thing. When we were doing some work with mother fawn pairs where we would collar adult females, and then we were able to capture their offspring as fawns and monitor the fawns. The females, we put, the location would be an hour all year long. Every hour we would get a location, but at that case, the collar's only going to last about a year. Whereas if we do a much longer or variable schedule, we can make those collars last, 3 years.
Oh, wow. You actually answered my next question, was going to be what's the average battery life, but obviously it sounds like it depends on exactly how many locations you're pinging off that collar. So 1 to 3 years is probably typical.
Yeah. It just depends on how intense the locations you need. The technology is changing. Cell phones have been a huge boon because, there's billions of dollars invested into cell phone technology, and that technology is just getting put into these wildlife collars. I mean, the wildlife profession, the amount of money we spend on collars is peanuts compared to what people spend on cell phones. And so it's that cell phone technology that's really allowing us to be able to follow deer, for 2 or 3 years and have the satellite communications and all that sort of stuff.
It sounds like a great benefit, kind of how the commercial marketplace benefited from military GPS, kind of passing that technology down and across industries.
Yeah, we're at the bottom of the totem pole for sure.
Well, the last thing I wanted to talk about is, I guess the last thing I wanted to talk about concerning the collars is what should a hunter do if they harvest a collared deer? I think there's a lot of confusion about the proper procedures. Can you explain how you would want a hunter to report a deer harvested that had one of your GPS collars or ear tags on it?
It's pretty simple. If it's a deer that's legal to harvest and you want to harvest it, then we encourage you to harvest that deer. One of our objectives is to understand hunter harvest rates, and if people don't harvest our radio collared deer, then we're not going to get, the data that we need. So you're not taking away something from us. You're actually helping us if that deer is legal to harvest and it's a deer that you would have wanted to harvest, then go ahead and harvest it. When they do, the radio collar will have a tag on there with a toll-free number to call. We also ear tag deer, like some deer, let's say they're too young, or we've caught all the adult females we need or all the adult males, and we'll just ear tag them and let them go. So ear tag deer and collared deer have a toll-free number that they can call to report the harvest.
Okay, so people shouldn't have any apprehension or fear if it's got a collar on, like you said, if it's legal to harvest and that's a deer they're interested in. Absolutely nothing wrong with that.
Yep, that's right.
And then I would imagine that you also highly encourage people to report that, or what are they supposed to do with the actual collar itself? Let's say I harvest a buck and it's got a collar on. I call that number. Do I then mail it in, or you guys pick it up? How do you take care of the collar at that point?
Oh, well, to encourage cooperation, there's a reward. It's stated on the collar, on the ear tag, to report the harvest. So we'll pay you. If the deer has a collar, we'll either figure out some way to pick it up, or we'll just pay you to mail it back to us.
Okay, no, that's great information. Like I said, I think there's a lot of confusion out there about what exactly is the right thing to do, so it's good to hear it from the source. Let's go ahead and move into some habitat discussion and Pennsylvania's hunting season dates. And the first thing I want to talk about is the study areas themselves and how you would classify them. So one of the terms that's commonly used with the people that I associate with is big woods. And what I mean by big woods is little to no agricultural ground in large, continuous sections of forest. And then farm ground would be like moderate to heavy agricultural ground, or is it some mix in between there? What's the study areas like?
Yeah, so we have 4 study areas. They're all on state forest land. So the study areas themselves are 96%, 99% forest, just contiguous forest. I mean, there's forest roads. There might be a few small openings. Of course, there's different age stands of forest, maybe pipelines or power line right-of-ways. But basically, the study areas themselves are 95+% forested. Now, the landscape context in which they're located is a little bit different. Our 2 areas up north, which would be called the Big Woods area, where there's probably about 2 million acres of public land, and most of that being forested. In that area, our study areas are mostly forested, and they're surrounded by forest. In the 2 southern study areas, and I guess the other thing I should mention is those forests up north are what's called northern hardwoods. So the predominant tree species would be black cherry, sugar maple, beech. There'd be some hemlocks in the wetter drainages. You know, some oaks, not a lot of oaks, but just northern hardwoods.
Okay.
Our 2 southern areas are in what we call the Ridge and Valley region. So in Pennsylvania, if you're familiar with Shenandoah Valley, it's kind of like that. So we have these long linear ridges that go from the southwest to the northeast. And the ridges are primarily forested, and the valleys are where there's agriculture and human developments. So our 2 study, and it's also in what we call the oak hickory forest. So on the ridge tops, it would be chestnut oak. When you get a little bit wetter and deeper soils, you get some red oaks and white oaks, yellow poplar. There's some hemlock in the drainages, red maple. So those would be the tree species. So, and hickories, of course. So that's called an oak hickory forest type. Oftentimes the understory is ericaceous shrubs. It could be mountain laurel, a lot of huckleberry and blueberry, especially on the ridge tops and drier sites.
Mountain laurel, every hill country deer hunter's favorite plant.
Yeah, and so the ridges are sandstone, much poorer soils. The valleys, of course, where the people are and growing the crops, you know, those are limestone soils, deeper soils, more moisture. So it's sort of a 50-50 mix of forested ridges and open valleys.
Okay.
And again, so we still have large tracts of woods, but they're centered on ridges and surrounded by ag.
No, that's a great explanation. So it sounds like the southern study regions are more typical Midwest type deer hunting, and then the northern regions would be more like what I think of as northern Wisconsin, northern PA, northern Michigan, where you've got a lot of really large contiguous forests. So I think that's good to give some context to the areas for the rest of the discussions we're going to have. So moving into the actual deer season dates, I've never hunted in PA, and probably a lot of the listeners haven't. So what are the typical archery and rifle season dates in PA?
Archery opens up about the first Saturday, like the first Saturday in October. In the past, it has run for about 6 weeks, so into the rut, the first half of the rut. We have a early muzzleloader that is antlerless only season in the 3rd week in October. For older hunters, there are 3 days that they can hunt with a high-powered rifle. And then our rifle season begins, well, it used to begin the Monday after Thanksgiving, but there have been some recent changes that it opens the Saturday after Thanksgiving, and we're actually going to have some Sunday hunting this year for the first time.
Yeah, talk about that real quick, because I don't think a lot of people know about that. Sunday hunting or until recently was not allowed at all, right, in PA?
Yeah, unless you were hunting crows or fox or coyote, there was no Sunday hunting. Pennsylvania is one of the few states that doesn't allow it or didn't allow it. It's still going to be mostly closed, but the legislature allowed 3 days of Sunday hunting. So there's going to be, things are changing so much it's hard to remember. But we'll actually have some Sunday hunting during the rifle season. Traditionally, it was a 12-day season that started on a Monday, the main hunting season, the rifle season. It would start on the Monday after Thanksgiving. You could hunt through that Saturday. Sunday was closed, and then you can hunt Monday through Saturday. So it was 12 days of hunting with no hunting on Sunday. Now we have a Saturday opener, and there'll be some Sunday hunting during that season.
Oh, that probably ought to make a lot of happy hunters in Pennsylvania, I'd imagine.
Some happy, some unhappy. You know, there's a lot of tradition to deer hunting, especially in Pennsylvania, where a lot of people, what they would do is after Thanksgiving, they would travel to the camp. So the big woods, you know, when people say big woods, it's actually a capital B and a capital W. And it has a special meaning in that that part of the state historically is where back at by the 1900s, there were very few deer left in Pennsylvania, and most of the deer existed up in north central Pennsylvania in what's called the Big Woods. And in those public lands, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania actually leased land, state forest land, so they would lease like a half acre or an acre, and someone could build a camp, so they would own the camp, but they were only leasing the land from the state. And the reason they did that is because to get there to go hunting, you would have to take trains and horse and wagons to get to your camp. And so when people would go up deer hunting, they would stay for the whole 12-day season.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so there's a lot of tradition, and so traditionally people after Thanksgiving would head up north to the big woods to their deer camps. They would have, you know, travel day would be Friday, they'd have Saturday, Sunday to get settled in camp, and then the deer season opened on Monday. And so there's a strong tradition, and a lot of people are not happy about the Saturday opener, especially ones that have that camp tradition. But, you know, deer are everywhere in Pennsylvania now, and so a lot of people, you know, can hunt out there. You know, they just have to drive a few miles down the road or maybe hunt out the back door. They don't have to travel to north central Pennsylvania to go deer hunting. And for those folks, I suspect that the opportunity to hunt on Sunday is probably better accepted. But, you know, it is... Change is always controversial, and we have a lot of change here in Pennsylvania coming up. Well, last year and this year especially in the hunting season. So the rifle season, you know, is the main season where most deer are harvested. After the rifle season, the day after Christmas, we have a muzzleloader and archery opens back up, and that goes into January. Although in some of our, what we call special regs units, there is deer hunting that goes well into, and it's rifle deer hunting, like areas in the Philadelphia area and the Pittsburgh area where we need to harvest more deer. There's more hunting opportunity that with the rifle or shotgun into the late season.
Is that all antlerless harvest?
Well, it depends. If you're muzzleloader or archery hunting, you can harvest an antler deer if you have the tag, but yeah, most of it is focused. The focus is on harvesting antlerless deer.
Yeah, Michigan has some of that stuff in the last couple of years too, where all the seasons used to end January 1st, but now there's special zones that where either CWD is a concern or there's a really high antlerless population, and they've extended those seasons to the end of January, you know, an extra 31 days there.
Oh, I was going to say a lot of states have gone to extending season.
Yeah, less hunters. That seems like a viable management tool to try to keep the populations in check. Is that what you guys are seeing in PA as well?
Yeah, that's the objective of those late seasons, is to provide more hunting opportunity to try and keep deer populations at a socially acceptable level.
Okay, so I think we gave a good background about the study area and the kind of forest and the terrain there. And we also talked about the hunting seasons. Like I wanted to set the stage for the type of area and the season where this research is occurring. One of the things that I'm really interested in, and it's been brought up in your research, is home range. So the first thing I'd like to discuss in home range is if you can define from a scientific perspective what you consider home range to mean.
So it's interesting. The idea of a home range actually goes back to a paper written in 1943 by a fellow named Burt, B-U-R-T. And he defined the home range as something like the area in which an animal traverses carrying out its normal activities of gathering food, mating, and rearing young. And the point is that that's really a concept, because what's a normal activity and what's an abnormal activity? So the idea of a home range is really a concept. It's difficult to define. And I'd also like to point out that a home range is different from a territory. So a territory is something that's defended. Wolves have territories. Deer do not have territories. Deer have a home range. So the home range is hard to define, but today with the location data that we collect and some of the more computer-intensive methods, we can at least identify a home range, and a home range is more than just a boundary, right? If you think about your own life, you traverse a lot of area, right? You go to the grocery store, you go to the hardware store, you go to your office, you go home. But where do you spend most of your time? You spend most of your time at the home and office. So you really could think about your home range as sort of a three-dimensional thing. It takes up space in X and Y, and there's also a time component in terms of where in that space do you spend most of your time. I don't know if that's making a lot of sense, but so a home range is difficult to define objectively. We do have some tools that you can kind of say, well, here's the shape of the home range, this is the area that encompasses, and we can also, with our data, show that deer spend more time in this part of their home range as opposed to another part. So we have a concept of what a home range is. We have some tools that we can sort of define it.
Yeah, and that's going to move into my second question, and this is going to be something that's important to my audience, and that's how the home range changes. And you mentioned the temporal element of the home range, how it changes throughout the season. So I know you guys have some data. Let's talk about a month by month. Let's start in September because we got a lot of September opener states, and go September, October, November, December. How does the home range change across those months? If you could touch on that a little bit.
Actually, I'm going to back up. So let's just start in, let's say, January.
Okay.
Because what you want to do is jump right into the breeding season, and that's the interesting part. So in January, February, March, all the way through September, there's really no breeding. There's very, very little breeding going on. Of course, there is some birthing going on with females. But through that whole time period, the home range size does not change a whole lot. If we get some severe winter weather, movements may be restricted and you might see slightly smaller home ranges. But even females that give birth to young, they're basically traversing the same area that they do at other times of the year. And in our study areas, that's about 1 square mile, whether it's a male or a female. An adult male or adult female has a home range about 1 square mile.
So just for clarity, from January to, let's say, the beginning of September, both male and female, and 1 square mile, that's 640 acres, right? So that's the average or typical home range?
Yep, on our study areas.
Okay.
And I'd say that that's going into through September and into early October. Now, where things change is around the middle of October. That third week in October, some of the females start coming into estrus, and breeding activity gets started, and we see male home ranges are increasing in size. Half of our females are bred by the 13th of November. So the rut is in full swing in that first half of November. Half the females are bred by the middle of November, and then you'll recall our rifle season occurs after Thanksgiving. And so basically our breeding season is pretty much done by Thanksgiving.
Okay.
What happens to home range is that males are going from a 1 square mile to 3, 4, some deer are probably covering 5 square miles.
From 600 to up to 3,000 acres potentially during that period.
Yep. And females, what we've observed on our study areas is their home range actually declines a little bit. So at the peak of the rut, when most of those females are in estrus, their home range sizes actually get smaller. And from a breeding strategy, that makes a lot of sense because the bucks are running around everywhere looking for females. And I like to say is if you're lost in the woods, what are you told to do?
Stay where you're at.
That's right. So that's what the females are doing, is actually reducing their movements so they should be easier to be found by the males. So their home ranges, they don't decline a lot, so they're going from 600 acres or so to maybe 500, 400 or 500. It's not a huge decline, but there is a noticeable decline in the size of their home range during that during the breeding period.
No, that's definitely interesting. One of the other interesting things that I read when I was reviewing the blog for this podcast was that some of your research seems to indicate that home ranges, or the perimeter, I should say, of a home range will be defined by terrain features like creeks or man-made features like pipelines. So if I'm a hunter and I'm out there trying to pin down the home range of a buck that I've got on trail camera or that I've seen out in an agricultural field, is that something I should be looking for, these type of obstacles?
Yeah, if it's not the breeding season, that might help you. So, I mean, a lot of different animals do this in that if there are physical features that kind of divide an area, that will be the boundary. So, you can watch your robins in your yard, right? And you'll have one robin has a territory on one side of the house, and another robin has his territory on the other side, the opposite side. And there could be a hedgerow, and things like that are natural boundaries, end up being boundaries of animals' territory. And those are defended things, right? Now, home ranges are a little different. There's no defense going on. But I've noticed our deer that if there's a power line, that deer, the edge of its home range is defined by that power line. It might be defined by roads or streams. So, yeah, if you were trying to, but during the rut, I don't think that's going to help you. But outside the rut, so let's say you get a picture of a nice buck, I think you'd be less likely to get a picture of that buck on another game camera if you put that camera on the other side of the road, as opposed to thinking, saying, okay, I saw this buck here, what are some natural boundaries, and then put some other cameras that are within that boundary, and you might have a better chance of picking that buck up at different places on your camera. But during the rut, all bets are off. I mean, those things are covering a huge area. I don't think that's going to help you at all.
real quick, and this wasn't in the outline, but I'm curious now that we're talking about it, and maybe you know, maybe you don't know. When you talk about roads, I would imagine a gravel road is different than a 2-lane highway, is different than a 4-lane highway, or a stream or creek is different from a river or a really large river. Have you found any data to support that?
Yeah, so a lot of my research has been looking at dispersal behavior in deer, and that's where we actually collared those 8 months old that I talked about. And with those deer, what we found is if you have a state route or an interstate or a large river, those features will actually inhibit dispersal. So if a deer grows up in its what we call its natal home range where it was born, and it decides to disperse, it's going to disperse away from a 2-lane highway. And if it runs into another highway, it's more likely to stop. So we know that, state routes, some of your larger 2-lane roads, interstates for sure, deer will cross them, but they're less likely to cross them. And then deer that if they set up a home range in which they have to go back and forth across a road, they usually end up getting hit. And that's even in our current study areas, most of our roads are just gravel roads, but we do have a few 2-lane roads. And so we still get some road kills. And if a deer sets up a home range in which she's going back and forth across the road, she usually ends up getting hit. So the deer that live longer tend to not have home ranges that encompass a road. The road will be a boundary or an edge of their home range. So yeah, I think for sure roads have an impact on how deer move and where they establish home ranges.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that's kind of my intuition or my gut feeling, but it's good to hear that that's the case from the GPS data too. The last thing I wanted to talk about in home ranges, so you talked about the dispersal of those year and those 1.5-year-old deer, but you also have these radio collars or GPS collars on a lot of 2.5-year-old and older bucks. Have you seen anything to support or refute a shift in home range from one geographic area to another, specifically during the breeding season? And what I mean by that is, let's say you have your home area, the 640 acres is area A, where this deer spends January to September. Does it go to an area B that's different during the rut? And if so, how far away on average?
Well, I'd say 90% of deer, if you collected all their locations and took the average and got the center of their home range, during the rut, the center location doesn't change. Their home range just gets bigger. Most deer don't shift, what I call shift the home range, where they're in one location and then they move to another location. There's very few deer, males or females, that do that. There are a few exceptions. I mean, we did have one deer down in our southern study area that he'd move, it was 3 or 4 miles. And he did that, we followed him, I think, 3 years. He apparently had a place where he would, when the rut started, he would shift and move about 3 miles, spend the whole rut, maybe even December, over at this other location, and then sometime, usually in December, but sometimes not until January, would then move back to that other home range and spend his time there the whole year. That's really unusual. Most deer, they have a location, and if you plotted all the points, it just looks like an egg or something.
Right, and the egg just gets bigger during the rut, then, is what you're saying?
Yep. That's what most deer do. In fact, they don't even shift. Most deer don't even shift during the rifle season when we have huge hunter pressure. They don't leave their home range.
Okay. Yeah, we're gonna get into that a little bit more with some questions I have later. But no, that's a lot of really great insights on home range, especially how that expands throughout the breeding season, and the shifting or the lack thereof. It sounds like shifting is definitely the exception rather than the rule from your data. So that's going to be interesting, I think, to a lot of people. I want to move into the wind a little bit. In the study area, as you mentioned, is primarily ridge and valley, or what people that listen to my podcast would call hill country. So one of the questions I had is, have you looked at any correlation between wind direction and bedding location? And why I wanted to ask this question is there's an anecdotal theory that seems to be supported by a lot of hunter empirical observations that deer bed just below ridge tops with the wind coming over the ridge, so the deer can look downhill, see danger from below, and smell danger from behind. Do your collars allow you to see that type of data or fidelity, or is this something you guys have ever looked into?
Well, yeah, I do have some insights. It's kind of tough because, wind is really local. So I can get weather data about what direction the wind's coming from, but, whether you're on the north, south, or east side of a hill completely depends on how the wind is moving in your local area. And, of course, that's how I'm sure deer are responding to wind. And so I really don't have any way to measure that, to say, oh, these deer are sitting, finding this spot because the wind is coming from this direction. Well, the weather station that's 3 miles or 5 miles or 10 miles away might say the wind's coming out of the west, but where that deer is sitting, I really don't know how the wind is blowing. So we don't have a lot of insights onto exactly how wind influences how deer move or where they bed down or that sort of thing. But I can say that, my observation, especially if you go out in the wintertime and look for deer beds, if you can find a little shelf that's south-facing, you're probably going to find deer beds, right? Because the deer are getting sun, they can bed down on that shelf, and they can look down below and see anything that's coming. So there has to be something to this idea that they're picking sites where they can visually watch for danger in one direction and smell danger coming in another direction. And we do see that in bucks, especially during the intensive rifle season, where there's a lot of hunting pressure. I mean, there's a lot of people hunting deer in Pennsylvania because we have, something like 600,000 or 800,000 deer hunters in the state. So there's a lot of pressure. And what we see happen with the bucks is that in the morning they will run to a spot within their home range that's like at the crest of a ridge, and they might be on the east side, on the leeward side of that ridge, and then they can look down, and of course if anything bumps them, within 15 seconds they can, jump up and be down, 500 feet from where they were in, just a few seconds. So we see that repeatedly, and if you go on our blog, we've got lots of movies of bucks during the rifle season, and you can see how they have these preferred spots to hang out in the early morning when all the hunters are trudging into the woods to their deer stands. Yeah, there's got to be something to it. Unfortunately, my radio collars don't tell me what wind direction is yet.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned the localized wind, and I think that's the bane of every bow hunter I know as you look at the weather forecast. And like you said, that's coming from a weather station 5, 10, 20 miles away, and then you get out to your hunting area and due to some topography or vegetation, terrain, whatever, that it's doing something very different than what's forecast. So that's a good way to ruin a lot of bow hunting days. At least I've experienced that.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, and one of the other things that you just talked about there, and it's a perfect segue into the next question, is that these deer in your study area have these hideouts. And from what I remember, those hideouts seem to be pretty remote in the hills. They seem to be pretty steep. How long does it take the deer in the study area to respond to hunting pressure?
very quick. So traditionally, as I mentioned, deer season opened on Monday, and of course everyone was going into the woods on Saturday and setting up their tree stand. And so by Sunday, those deer have already figured out what's going on and what they're going to do. And what I point out to people is deer don't make this conscious decision of, oh, it's deer season, I need to run to my hiding spot. They're more of a just response to a stimuli. So deer that have been disturbed and have run off and run to a spot, and it turns out that they don't get disturbed there, then they've learned that when there's disturbance, run over here and I'm not going to be bothered. Deer that doesn't happen to, I think, probably get shot. But, our study areas, they have some extremely steep slopes. So what foresters would call 100% slope, which would be 45 degrees.
Okay.
And so there's some very steep spots in all of our study areas. In the ridge and valley, there'll be talus slopes, so there's, rocks the size of pillows or bigger, that it's hardly any vegetation, extremely difficult, especially if it's wet, to walk on. And deer find these areas or happen upon these areas and learn that if I run here, I'm not going to get disturbed. And so that's what we see, and they learn, and the day before deer season trains them that there's a disturbance, I need to run to my hiding spot. And they quickly learn that if they sit in that hiding spot from 4 in the morning till 10 or 12, like noon the next day, then in the afternoon they can get up and start moving, and by 4 or 5 o'clock, when it's after legal shooting hours, they're back down in the areas where they're foraging, the better foraging sites, and then by 4 o'clock in the morning, they're running back to their hiding spot.
So you think as little as 24 hours or that first disturbance, that's enough to push these deer into those hiding spots?
Yep, for sure. I mean, we see it in the movies. And the other thing is, traditionally we've had a bear season the week before Thanksgiving, and that doesn't disturb them as much, but that's another trigger too. I mean, there's just a lot of, we have almost 200,000 bear hunters in Pennsylvania, and that's another, of course, bear hunting is not as widespread as deer hunting, but that potentially is another trigger for deer.
Right. They might get bumped around during bear season, then they get bumped around if someone's out the day before deer season checking out their stand, and that might be 2 times as enough to send them into that hideout.
Yep.
Well, let's get into some of the actual movement data now from the GPS collars, and I think some of this information, at least to me, was real interesting. What's the most amount of miles that you've seen deer cover in a single day, or maybe if you don't have a single day data, in a single month, and what time of year is that?
Well, the most movements would be males during the rut. Outside the rut, over the course of a month, you're talking probably less than a mile a day. So, they might cover 25 miles over the course of 30 days. During the rut, that's going to triple. Conservatively, because all I have is a series of points, right? And I'm just drawing straight lines from one point to the next. But, those deer might move 90, over 100 miles during the rut. Because the rut takes place about a month, from late October to late November. So over those 30 days, they're moving well over 100 miles, some of those bucks.
Yeah, that's crazy, especially in that tough hilly terrain.
Yeah, and in the course of a day, I've seen some bucks, in 24 hours move 15 miles, probably another mile or two in elevation change. Those bucks, if you look at their movements during the rut, they're not moving really fast, but they're moving constantly. And they very little resting. You see a slight decline around 4 o'clock in the morning, but they're just moving almost basically 24/7. It's at a very slow pace, but it's constant. And so that's how they just cover the miles. I mean, they're covering, like I mentioned, on average 2 to 3 square miles instead of a square mile. Some of them are covering 5 square miles, and they're doing that. They're just walking. They're not eating. They're not sleeping very much. They're just looking for breeding opportunities.
Yeah, when you said slow pace, I think I remember reading in one of the blogs something that sticks out was like 0.8 miles an hour. So on average, less than 1 mile an hour. Obviously, that varies during the day, but is that still a pretty accurate number?
Yeah. I mean, of course, I don't walk 24/7 for a month, but I have a hard time walking 0.8 miles per hour. I mean, it's not that fast. I mean, that's a pretty leisurely stroll if you think about it down the sidewalk. Of course, they're walking through the woods, but still, they're not hoofing it, but it's, slow and steady wins the race. So the animal that can keep moving, covering large areas, is going to maximize his breeding opportunities.
No, that makes a lot of sense, especially like you said, it's a month long. That's a marathon, not a sprint. One of the other things I wanted to talk about with the movement specifically has to do with midday movement in early November. And I read one of the blogs, I believe it was the November 3rd, 2014 blog. There were some observations in there and kind of talk about, normally I think we talked about January to September. Deer are a crepuscular animal, meaning they have movement peaks around dawn and dusk, which I think most people know, but it seems like that pattern kind of shifts in November. So if you could talk about any observations you have in early November and midday movements.
Well, all right, so there's 2 kinds of movements, right? So in our archery season, where most of the rut's going on, those deer they're not being pushed by hunters. We have a few 100,000 archery hunters, but that's nothing compared to the rifle season. So I've not seen any evidence that the hunter activity during the archery season influences deer movements. They're crepuscular. If it's a male, they're still going to be a little more active, early morning and evening, but there's a lot of activity going on 24/7. So yeah, I'm not sure, what to say other than, this is normal behavior of white-tailed deer. The rifle season is a completely different story because the activity of hunters really affects the behavior of the deer. And they're still crepuscular, but, they're a little less active during those daylight hours. But don't discount the afternoon because, a lot of the bucks that I've monitored, that early morning hunt, which even for me, that's when I go out, right? Because you tend to see more deer and they're more active. But a lot of those older bucks, they're already in their hiding space and they're not moving. And they won't move, 8, 9 o'clock in the morning. They're still sitting where they were at 4 o'clock in the morning. But a lot of them do get up and start moving around noon. And so I wouldn't discount, if you're interested in an older, bigger buck, hunting that afternoon time period. Deer are definitely less active, but in some ways, these older bucks tend to be more active. And even the females, too. They hunker down in that early morning because all the cars are driving in. Hunters are heading leaving the roads and heading to their deer stands or wherever they're hunting. And the deer have already hunkered down.
I think on average, too, the average deer hunter is not quite as stealthy as you think. So those deer, I gotta imagine they hear that army coming through the woods before it's ever light out, or before, like you said, they're already in those hiding spots.
Well, I can tell you how, you're not going to sneak up on a deer because our radio collars, sometimes we can drop them off so when the batteries get old, the field techs have to go out, and if they can get within a couple hundred yards of them, they can send a signal that causes the collar to disconnect, and the radio collar will fall off the deer, and they have a hard time getting within 200 yards of a deer.
They know where that deer's at already, right? From some sort of telemetry.
Yeah, they have equipment. They can tell. They can triangulate and estimate where that deer is and figure out the best way to try and get within a couple hundred yards. And some days they just can't do it. It might take them 2, 3, 4 tries before they get close enough to that deer. And that doesn't even mean that they see it. It just means that they're within 200 yards so the transmitter can, send that signal to drop the collar.
Yeah, they're tough to get close to, that's for sure. I know there's a lot of people out there that are listening that I'm sure have stories of trying to close the distance with a bow and it doesn't work out. I know I've got a lot of those. Well, let's talk about temperatures, and specifically during the rut. And I don't know if you have data on this or not, but a lot of people that I know believe that warm temperatures during the rut shuts down daytime movement. Now, I'm a firm believer that the rut happens at roughly the same time every year. It sounds like you said the peak in PA is around November 13th. But is it possible, or do you have any data that says warmer temperatures result in more rutting activity occurring at night? Any support for that or against that?
Well, I did look at that once. I think it was a couple of years ago when we had an extremely warm fall, and looked to see if movement rates of bucks was any different during that warm year compared to the more normal temperatures in other years. And I couldn't see any difference. To me, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, I guess the heat could influence their movements. I mean, I know I can't run as fast when it's hot out, but these deer aren't running, right? They're just strolling at 0.8 miles per hour. It doesn't make sense that the heat would shut down the rut. I mean, the heat isn't going to influence whether a female comes into estrus, so it wouldn't make sense for a male not to continue pursuing females. The one thing I do want to say is the data that we have on the rut, the Game Commission collected thousands and thousands of, it's over 6,000 roadkill deer over a 6-year period. And then we could look at, of those road-killed females, we could open them up and look at their ovaries, or their ovaries, and look for embryos and look at reproduction. And so that the average, the timing of when deer breed does not change from one year to the next. There's no evidence that it changes.
Right, and that's a big sample size over a relatively long time. Then 6,000 deer, 6 years. That's not like you looked at 5 deer over 1 month or something.
Right, but what you have to keep in mind is that you're not necessarily hunting the average deer, right? The area where you hunt, the deer may be coming into estrus later or earlier, so individual hunters, when they say, there's no rutting activity going on, well, that may be because that area where you are, for some reason, there's not a lot of females in estrus. So the variation that hunters observe that's to be expected. But the fact is that that's not what's happening to all the deer. That's just happening to the deer that you're observing. So, my going out in my back 40 and looking at deer behavior and saying whether the rut is early or late this year doesn't really mean anything. Yeah, it might mean for my back 40, but, statewide, on average, it's the same time every year. As hunters, we're seeing this individual variation.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up because I would say almost all of our discussion today, we're talking about macro, large-term trends, the bell curve. We're not talking about, individual areas or isolated incidents. So I want to make sure anybody that's listening, this is all average talk, and that's most of your research, correct?
Yeah, I'm trying to get as big a sample size as I can and, make some inferences about general patterns. But, the variability is important too. And unfortunately, as hunters, what we see is the variability is really important and really drives what we see.
No, that does. It makes a lot of sense. Well, since we talked about, and maybe we already answered this question, but I want to ask it anyways. There's a myth of the quote-unquote nocturnal buck. And again, that could be an individual deer. But let's talk about on average. I'd like you to discuss your observations. And specifically, I read the blog during the 2013 rifle season where you had several different bucks collared. If you could talk about what you saw about quote-unquote nocturnal bucks.
Well, yeah, it's kind of hard to define. But the patterns that we see are that crepuscular pattern that you mentioned earlier, right? Peak of activity around sunrise and sunset. That doesn't really change, but you do see an overall decline in movements. So they're still most active in the morning and the evening, but their activity overall is lower. So, I guess you could interpret that, or it might appear that they become nocturnal, but really what I think is happening is that their just activity in their movements is really declining. So in the rifle season, their home range might be 100 acres during daylight hours. So they're really restricting their movements, because of that hunting activity. Now this is during that rifle season when there's lots of hunter disturbance. So I don't really think it's that the deer are going nocturnal. It's that they're just reducing their movements so much that it appears like they are. And I even know when I look at my game camera pictures, like, why can't I ever see that guy during daylight hours? He's always showing up my game camera at 3 o'clock in the morning, and that doesn't help me.
No, that's a good point. And so the forum or community I'm a part of, there's a popular hunting forum called the Hunting Beast, and kind of one of the tenets of the philosophy on there is you need to get really close, especially early and late season. All times of the year, but especially those, because those deer are moving so little. They're moving in daylight still, but like you said, might only be in a 100-acre area. So if you're not honed into that area, you're not in the game at all. So let's move on and talk about rain. One of the blogs had some information about rain, and I am admittedly a fair weather hunter. I don't like to go out and get rained on, get wet at all. I don't mind the cold. I don't mind the warm, but I'm not a fan of rain. So what have you guys found concerning heavy rains?
So rain, as it influences deer movements, the work that some of my undergrads that have worked with me on have found is that for females, they really don't respond to rain. Their movements don't change a whole lot. But males, if you had to say anything, that it appears that their movements actually decline a little bit in the rain. But, it's not huge, but statistically they can say, yeah, they move less when it's raining. For females, there really is limited effect.
Okay, and I heard you mention wind in there too, and I think again you had some undergrads look at wind. What did you find? Because I think it's a common perception that the deer don't move on really windy days. True or false?
You might say that there's some influence, but it's not huge. And again, we're looking at averages, but for the most part, there's not a lot of effective wind. Although You have to keep in mind that when you want to start looking at weather, you have to look at deer movements outside the rut. Because during the rut, it doesn't matter what's going on. Those deer are going to be moving. So when we've looked at weather, we've always looked at late September and early October in that, early archery season. Because once you get towards the end of October, it's the rut, and it doesn't matter whether it's raining, it's a hurricane, or whatever. Those deer are just focused on breeding. And if you were to expect to have weather have any effect on their movements, it would be before the rut kicks in. And during that time of year, it's a nice time of year, right? Some years we don't even get that much rain, and we don't get a lot of wind. So it's really difficult to say that wind or rain has a big effect because it's such a nice time of year. Now, if you looked in January or February, but generally we're not hunting deer in January or February, deer probably respond to those winter storms. Although I had a student look at that, and she really didn't find a whole lot of effect there either. So no, I would say that wind and rain doesn't have a lot of effect on deer movements. Although, my personal observations are when it's really windy and deer can't hear, they're really skittish and they're really flighty. But
they're still up and moving.
They're still up and moving, exactly. So unfortunately, rain is not an excuse to stay in, but I don't care. I don't want to get wet, and I don't go hunting in the rain.
Yeah, what I heard is before the middle of October, rain is an excuse to stay in, but during the rut, it's not. So maybe I'll start hunting the rainstorms during the rut, but not before then.
Yeah.
Well, one of the other things that I heard you mention earlier was the moon also. So let's talk about the rut and what kicks it off. And I think there's two schools of thought, and maybe some people, there's a third that kind of believe in both of them. But the two theories that I've heard are photoperiod and moon phase. What's the research indicate? What do you believe?
All the research indicates that it's photoperiod. It's been proven experimentally with captive deer. In fact, people that raise deer for commercial purposes, like red deer in New Zealand, they can shift the timing of breeding just by putting deer in pens and controlling the photoperiod.
Oh, really?
And the reason that this is it's deer getting pregnant in the fall. That gestation period is 200 days. So in Pennsylvania, they're getting pregnant. Half of them are pregnant by November 13th, and half of those females have given birth by June 1st. The strategy of the deer is that I want to give birth to a fawn as early in the spring as possible so that fawn can get as big as possible before winter comes. But I don't want to give birth too soon such that I give birth and it gets hit by a late snowstorm or really cold weather that it's possible that my fawn is going to die from exposure. So what could you use to predict the best time to give birth in the spring? You're not going to use the moon. You're going to use day length. Because when the day length of November 13th, 200 days later, you're going to end up giving birth in the spring as early as possible, but not too late, and so that my fawn has the greatest chance of surviving when it's young, so that it's as big as possible coming into its first winter. So it doesn't make any sense that the breeding date would change from one year to the next based on the moon, and that's where the research has shown that it's photoperiod that drives when breeding occurs. Now, of course, there's some variability, but again, when people, observe that variability in breeding activity and say it's the moon, I'm saying that that's just random chance. You're just a small sample of deer. But when you collect 6,000 deer over 6 years and look to see whether it's related to the moon or not, I can show you unequivocally that the rut doesn't change from one year to the next.
No, that's good to hear. And I mean, I've read quite a few studies, and I tend to believe the same thing, and that I'm going to put a lot more credence and, like you said, a large sample size than I am my own personal experience, which may or may not support, moon phases or whatever. One of the other things I wanted to talk about, and specifically about does coming into estrus, is let's talk about if they're not bred the first time they came into heat. When do they come in again? Because a lot of people seem to think there's kind of a second rut, and also maybe talk about does that it's their first year that they're breeding. Don't they often come in a little bit later than, say, 2-3 weeks after that November 13th peak?
So when a female comes into estrus, and if she doesn't get bred, she'll cycle and she'll come into estrus again about 21 to 30 days later. And they can even repeat that if they don't get bred. But our data in Pennsylvania show that there's got to be very few females that don't get bred the first time they come into estrus, because there is no second peak. There is one peak. Half the females are bred by November 13th, and then there's a long tail where some females don't even get bred until January, and some even into February, which is really extreme. But variability is good, right? Because that way animals can adapt to changing conditions and that sort of thing. So there is no such thing as a second rut. But what does happen is that fawns will come into estrus later, and that's because a deer has to have a certain body mass and fat content before they're going to come into estrus. And so those fawns that were born in June, many of them are not going to be big enough to come into estrus, but if they do, it's going to be much later than the adult females. So when we have this peak at November 13th, we have a tail that extends, but that tail is made up of mostly fawns that get pregnant and come into heat later.
Okay.
So, it might seem like you have a second heat or cycling and there's a second rut, but really probably what you're seeing is maybe the fawns in your area, hitting that body size that allows them to come into estrus, and then there's males chasing them around.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and I mean, speculating here, but it seems logical that rich agricultural ground or more moderate climates, you're going to have a lot more of that going on than, say, north central PA.
Oh, exactly. I mean, in our northern study areas, it's basically 0% of fawns are going to get pregnant that first fall.
Oh, wow, that low, huh?
Yeah, in our southern study areas, maybe 10%, but in some parts of Pennsylvania, 30 to 50% of fawns are getting pregnant. And those are in our better habitats and in areas with better soils, either western PA or southeastern PA.
Okay, no, that makes a lot of sense. The last question I wanted to ask you about the rut and breeding has to do, and this is more folklore or anecdote. A lot of the good hunters I know seem to believe the tail end of the rut, and when I say tail end, I guess I mean the tail end of the peak. So let's say November 15th, 18th through Thanksgiving, the 28th type time frame, for the sake of this discussion, is the best time to kill an old big buck. Do you have any data that would support buck movement? We talked about bucks are moving a lot during November. Is there, even during that peak, is there an additional peak, maybe that last week or two, or is that baloney?
Well, I would think that well, I don't have a lot of data for a couple of reasons. One, an old deer in Pennsylvania is 3 or 4 years old. 5, 6, 7-year-old deer, we don't have a whole lot, although our study areas have a decent number. So we don't have real old deer. There's not a huge range in ages of bucks in Pennsylvania. The other thing, I guess if I had to say anything, is that I know some people who don't even bother hunting the first week of rifle season. They go out the second week just because there's way fewer. If you look at hunting activity, it's opening day and 2 or 3 days after that, and then Friday it picks up a little, and Saturday there's a lot. But the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday of the second week, there are very few hunters out there, especially compared to the first 2 days. And so there's less hunting pressure, and I think if you were after a big buck, and they might be less likely to do that. I'm going to hunker down for the first 4 hours of the day. They might be a little more active.
Okay.
For that reason, I think you might have a better chance, but I don't think it has anything to do with the breeding season. And for the most part, the tail end of the breeding season, we don't have hunting in Pennsylvania.
No hunting. Do you mean like February or that November 20th to 28th time frame?
Yeah, traditionally our archery season ended at the peak of the rut, and then there was nothing until after Thanksgiving.
Oh man!
So you couldn't even really hunt the tail end of the rut in Pennsylvania. And then the rifle season is, that's just crazy because there's so many people hunting.
Pennsylvania sounds like a tough state for the deer hunter. No Sunday hunting, no hunting during the second half of the rut. I don't know if that's my first choice to go deer hunting now.
Well, we still kill 60% of the older bucks every year, so there's still a lot of success going on.
A lot of opportunity despite those seasons, huh? Well, that's a good segue into the next question. I want to talk about survival rates. Now, let's say I had my eye on a buck all season. Maybe I saw him, but I didn't ever get a shot at him. And then I pick him up on game camera, or I see him with my binoculars after the season. And I'm talking about an adult buck now, 2.5 years or older. What are the odds that deer, as a percentage of 100, is going to survive the winter and be around next year?
In Pennsylvania, 90% or better. Most of our mortality once a deer hits a year old, hunting is the first primary cause of mortality. Then it's cars, vehicle collisions, and then after that, it's some disease. It's very minor. So outside the hunting season, if a deer survives the hunting season, there's a 90% or better chance that it's still alive come the next hunting season.
And of that 10% remaining, you're saying a large portion of that's if it gets hit by a car then, huh?
Most of that is vehicle collisions. Yeah, that's the second risk factor. And then after that, it's disease, predation, but it's really hard for us to separate out, was the deer killed by coyotes, or did the deer die and get scavenged by coyotes, or was it sick and the coyotes were able to kill it or something like that. So yeah, the odds of dying from predation are really, really low. So yeah, it's hunting is what drives deer population dynamics in Pennsylvania.
Okay. Now that's good to hear then. If I see one after season and I'm looking for it again next year, sounds like in Pennsylvania, which is similar to a lot of climates I hunt, and a lot of the people that are listening, Midwestern or northern Midwest, are going to be experiencing, there's a real good chance you're going to see that deer again next year.
But I do want to point out that in Pennsylvania is a little different in that we have essentially no winter mortality. Our winters are not severe enough to get a lot of winter mortality, so we're probably, my colleague says we're in the sweet spot. We're not so far south, at least until recently, we don't get a lot of diseases like EHD, and we're not far north enough to get those severe winters. So we don't have to worry about deer yarding up, winter mortality, or that sort of thing. So that's why one of the reasons why we have such a high survival rate outside the hunting season.
Okay, no, that's a good point to bring up, and maybe not something that's intuitive. I know Montana, where I'm at now, for example, on a severe winter, there'll be pretty high mortality rates sometimes. And I think it was 2012, maybe, and 2017 were both pretty severe winters. That was before I lived out here, but I've heard a lot of the locals talk about big die-offs in those years, and from freezing and just really severe winters.
Yeah, that's nothing that we don't get that in Pennsylvania. I mean, it's been decades. I mean, in the late 70s, we had a really bad year, but Pennsylvania even stopped recording any measures of winter severity because it's just not a factor.
Okay. And the other thing I wanted to talk about with buck survival is public lands, specifically public lands in your study area, which it sounds like they're either almost entirely or completely public lands. And I think there's a misconception out there that every buck gets killed on public land every year, right? There's no 2, 3, 4-year-old bucks. They're all getting killed as year-olds or 2-year-olds. So what does your data show the survival rates of these 2.5-year-old and older bucks on public lands to be in Pennsylvania?
Well, I've been monitoring survival of different sex and age classes of deer since the early 2000s. And back in 2002 and 2005, when we did the buck study, survival of Pennsylvania implemented antler point restrictions, and survival rate went from 20% in yearlings. It jumped up to 50 to 60%, and in older bucks, probably in the 40% range. So survival doubled, or at least doubled for bucks when we implemented antler point restrictions.
Can you talk about the antler point restrictions real quick? What's the specific restriction in PA for your area?
Well, we went from a deer had to have an antler at least 3 inches long or have 2 or more points. That was what was legal prior. And then in antler point restrictions, it depends on where you are in Pennsylvania, but it's either 3 or 4 points on one side, essentially is what it is.
Okay.
By doing that, we reduced the harvest rate on yearling males by 50%. So we cut it in half. Most 2.5 and older bucks are legal to harvest. So it did reduce the harvest rate on the older bucks. I think that was just because a lot of times people could see, it had antlers, but I couldn't tell if it was legal. So we ended up, some of those older bucks had higher survival rates. But the antler point restrictions only protect those 1.5-year-olds mostly.
Right. So in your opinion, antler point restrictions definitely work for protecting that age class of deer?
Well, they worked in Pennsylvania because we had, prior to antler point restrictions, we harvested 80% of the antlered deer every year. And so those antler point restrictions had a huge effect on the number of deer that survived to the next hunting season to be 2.5 years old. But in a lot of states, like some of your western states, you already have fairly low harvest rates on those bucks, and by putting in antler point restrictions, you're really not going to gain a whole lot of benefit from it. So it really depends on the population dynamics and growth rates of your population.
No, appreciate those insights. That's something I hadn't thought about.
We could talk for 2 hours on just antler point restrictions.
Well, maybe we'll have to have you back on a second time, and we can do that. For now, let's go ahead and move into, I think this is a controversial topic somewhat too, aging deer on the hoof and rack size. So a lot of my audience is trying to target older age class, bigger racked, mature, bigger bodied deers. And I know in the area of Michigan that I hunted, and I'm assuming in the big woods of PA, a mature buck isn't always sporting a 140-inch or larger rack. Are there any indicators that a hunter can depend on reliably to age a deer on the hoof? And if so, what are they?
Well, I'm not the best person to ask because I'm a scientist and I need as accurate estimate as possible. And I know that visually aging deer is not accurate enough for the work that I do. In fact, in Pennsylvania, we just age deer as 6-month-old, year and a half, or 2.5 and older. Because otherwise there is no good way to age them unless you pull a tooth and section it, and that takes a lot of time and costs a lot of money.
Right, like cementum annuli or whatever that's called.
Yep, exactly. It's like counting tree rings. But in terms of aging a deer on the hoof, I mean, you can do it. It'll get you in the ballpark, but I guarantee you that you could have errors of 2 or 3 years. There's been a little bit of work done on it, and it's not very accurate, but certainly it's a guide. And, if you want, there's some books out at, QDMA, the Quality Deer Management Association. They've got a lot of good info on looking at characteristics of older deer. And they'll get you closer than if you didn't do anything. It's just looking at the size of the rack. But they've shown that you can be off by 2 or 3 years using those characteristics. So, it depends what your purpose is. I think from a hunting standpoint, yeah, they'll help you identify perhaps an older, more mature buck. For me as a scientist, it's not a tool that would help me with my work if I need to know the age structure of a population.
Okay, no, I think that makes a lot of sense to me. And while we're talking about racks, one of the other blog entries I read that was interesting to me talked about velvet bucks and basically when the racks are done growing or developing. And I was kind of surprised by that date in that blog entry. Can you talk a little bit about when do you think antlers are pretty much done growing?
Well, apparently they're pretty much done growing the end of July. But I'm like you, I hate to believe it because I've been watching that buck all summer and he's still in velvet, and I swear they still got to grow because I want them to be bigger.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, most of that growth is done by now, and they'll be losing their velvet soon. So, or shedding the velvet. Yeah, it's pretty amazing that growth is so rapid, right? It starts in June, and 8 weeks later it's done.
Yeah, and it's amazing to me. So I've lived in Montana. This is my second year now to see the same thing with elk, and elk obviously grow huge antlers and they shed even later. And a lot of elk aren't shed until April, and then to see them put on all that antler by August, and they're out of velvet in mid-August a lot of times. So it's just it's an incredible process.
Yeah, and that that gets into nutrition and habitat quality, and most of that calcium is just being sucked out of their skeleton. There's no way that they could eat enough to eat the nutrients to grow those bones. So really, large antlers are a function of good habitat quality that's available year-round, as opposed to it's not the food that they're eating, while they're growing antlers.
Right, it's a function of, like you said, that diet and the minerals over the course of the entire year.
Yep.
Well, that's talking about nutrition and diet. That's a perfect segue into the next couple of questions I had. And I want to talk about deer browse, deer baiting, and food plots. And the first question is, do you believe baiting deer is detrimental to overall deer herd health? Why or why not?
Well, baiting deer, you mean in terms of during the hunting season?
Well, I mean, hunting season in general, what are your thoughts and opinions, or what's the science say?
Well, baiting, if it's done if you do it smart, with a feeder that distributes feed, at a certain time, so deer learn that if I'm the first one there, I'm going to get more feed than if I'm, a dawdler. So those timed feeders can be a good tool for, increasing the effectiveness of hunting in terms of trying to harvest more antlerless deer. But feeding or baiting in general is just a problem. Look at tuberculosis in Michigan. It's just a way to spread disease. And so deer managers have always, frowned upon feeding because you're artificially concentrating deer, you're increasing the risk of disease transmission, and that just leads to problems.
I know, a lot of areas in Michigan now, especially with CWD, have outlawed feeding completely. In Montana, it's illegal. It seems like that's the trend. And, my audience in general and myself, people are trying to hunt natural movement patterns. So there's not a lot of people that are listening to this that I think that are baiting deer, or I wouldn't expect that there are a lot. So it's just kind of curious of your thoughts on the topic, and it's going to lead into what's the last topic that I want to talk about here in a minute, which is going to be CWD. But before we get to that, so we're talking about baits, and when I think of baits, I think of, corn piles and apples, sugar beets, whatever, carrots. What about food plots? Any better, any worse? Why or why not?
Food plots, I guess it depends on, I guess you have the potential for concentrating deer a little bit more. I don't have a lot of research that I'm not aware of any research that indicates that food plots increase disease transmission. So, I'm not really against food plots from that perspective. I don't think there's any evidence out there that suggests that food plots increase disease transmission.
Okay. Any personal opinions that you want to share, or no?
Well, I just say that, I look around where I live, which is mixture of housing developments, forest, and farmland, and I don't see any need to put in a food plot because all the farmers around me have created food plots. The only benefit of a food plot would be to attract a deer, I guess, and increase my opportunity to harvest one. But I don't have any inclination or interest in putting in a food plot, on my property. And I guess, even if I owned some big woods, I wouldn't be that keen on, putting in a food plot either. That's just my opinion.
Sure.
I'm not really a farmer, so.
Yeah, that's I joke around, and if anyone's listening to this, I don't mean this offensive, but I always kind of categorize people into two areas these days. There's deer hunters and deer farmers, and it seems like a lot of the television shows, the big name people are deer farmers more than deer hunters. Well, the last question I had on this was about deer browse, and this is a topic that comes up a lot on the forum I'm a member of. It seems like everybody knows the common food sources, especially the ag crops, the soybeans, the corn, the alfalfa, and the mass crops, oaks and apples, the big stuff. But what about deer browse? Have you noticed any trends in the big woods or areas where there's not a lot of agriculture, any preferred browse plants that deer are honing in on, specifically if there's any during the hunting season? I'm sure people would be interested in that.
Well, by hunting seasons in Pennsylvania, it's pretty much, unless it's the early off season, there isn't a lot of green stuff. So it's really mostly browse or acorns, actually. It's the mass. If we have an acorn crop, acorns are far more important than any foods. So I would say that, understanding browse preference in terms of hunting in the big woods is pretty low on the scale of importance. It's way down there. What you would want to know is where are the acorns, especially white oaks, because they have lower tannin. And if it's a really bad year, but you might have a ridge that's got, a few oak trees that's got white oaks, that's what you would want to know. Other years, where you've got oaks everywhere, we can show that the research like turkeys is that the fall hunting season, if it's a good oak year, the harvest rates go way down because the turkeys are dispersed everywhere. And when we have a really poor mast year with the acorns, harvest rates go up. So it has, the mast has a huge impact on hunting during the archery season. Browse, nah, I don't think I would pay much attention to it. I mean, the food that's out there is really important to deer. Different times of the year, the spring herbs that come up, the flowers, Canada Mayflower. I mean, in the springtime, that might make up 90% of the diet. It's really important to lactating females. But during the hunting season, in the big woods and those forested areas, it's all about acorns. It's not about browse or species of browse, that sort of thing.
Okay. Well, and going back to our earlier discussion, it sounds like it'd be a lot more beneficial if you could somehow to find some of those hideouts than it would be to focus on what plants they're browsing on that time of year.
Well, for the rifle season, for sure. Archery where deer aren't influenced by the hunting, they're influenced more either the breeding or the food availability. Then, and again, that what would have an influence would be mast and where it is.
Well, that's a good takeaway from a scientist. So focus on the mast, and it sounds like even more so on limited mast years. If you can find some where there's not a lot, that's definitely going to be high on the priority list for deer in the area.
Yeah, but keep in mind they don't leave their home range. But if there is food within their home range, the areas where they spend is going to shift.
Okay. No, that makes a lot of sense. Well, the last thing I wanted to talk about, and it kind of goes back to the baiting discussion, is chronic wasting disease, or CWD. And it's impacting more hunters in more states every single year. I noticed this past year, Montana added more hunting zones where it's mandatory CWD check. Michigan has CWD now. So can you talk about your knowledge of CWD, and do you think CWD is at the beginning of the end for deer hunting? What's your predictions?
Well, I think chronic wasting disease is a serious problem. It could affect deer hunting in many different ways. One of those ways could be in hunters, whether they have an interest to go deer hunting. I know in Wisconsin and some parts of the state, there's probably if you shoot a buck, there's probably a 50% chance that when you get it tested, it comes back positive for CWD. Why would you want to shoot a deer if there's a 50% chance that you don't want to eat it? For me, that's, pretty disheartening. It also has implications for programs where, like in Pennsylvania, we have hunters sharing the harvest, where hunters donate deer that they harvest to, give to food banks and needy folks. Are we going to want to be giving away meat that's potentially contaminated with a disease that's fatal to deer and closely related to some diseases, similar diseases in humans? There's no evidence that it can be transmitted to humans, but the CDC isn't going to say that there's zero chance of that. So chronic wasting disease is serious. I think it's more serious out west because deer populations have lower reproductive rates, and so there's some evidence from Wyoming that it could impact the growth rates of deer populations and actually cause populations to decline. I'm not sure that could happen in the east because we have such high reproductive rates. I mean, we have very productive soils, high densities of deer, that even if chronic wasting disease isn't, it's so slow growing that a female could produce, for 1 or 2 years before she dies from the disease. So it may have less of an impact on eastern populations, but still that's a concern. Yeah, I'm very concerned about chronic wasting disease, and what effect it will have on the ability of wildlife managers to manage deer populations. And probably more, as important to me would be the traditions of hunting that could be lost, or how it could affect those traditions and opportunities.
Is there anything that you're aware of right now that hunters can do to help stop the spread?
The only thing that we know of right now is to reduce deer density. Slow this. Well, like you don't feed, don't bait in deer and do things that concentrate deer. They've shown that, mineral licks, puddles around mineral licks in the mud, they can actually detect the prion in that mud around mineral licks. So that, again, that concentrating deer, just don't do it. Don't feed, don't put out salt licks. Anything that causes deer to interact more than they normally would is going to increase the transmission of the disease. The other thing is, I think hunters need to recognize that the only tool we have in the toolbox right now is to reduce deer densities, which again will reduce transmission of the disease, at least it's thought of. And the largest segment of the deer population is female. And so it's very important to think about increasing harvest rates on antlerless deer. If you're going to want to reduce the population significantly, you're going to have to increase harvest rates on antlerless deer. And that means, when you do that, you're going to end up with lower deer densities. But I guess the question you have to ask yourself is, do you want lower deer densities and slow the spread of the disease? Or do you want to end up like Wisconsin and have every other deer that you shoot be infected with CWD?
Yeah, it's kind of a grim prospect for hunters either way. You want lower opportunity, maybe next year because you harvested more antlerless deer, or do you want the same opportunity and a lot higher prevalence of the disease? And it seems like, I know in Michigan and in the CWD area, kind of the south central part of the state where it's the most prevalent. I mean, it's even the last 2 seasons since it's been discovered, or 3 seasons now, it seems to be spreading rapidly, and higher percentages of the deer are testing positive.
It's not just transmission, but we know, the research that I've done in Pennsylvania, if you lower the deer population, you will have fewer males, and that means fewer males dispersing. We also know that in lower deer densities, fewer female fawns disperse, and they disperse farther on average than males. So reducing deer density isn't just to stop the transmission, but it also slows the spread of the disease because you have fewer of these dispersing deer dispersing and potentially spreading the disease. So there's multiple reasons why reduced deer densities can slow the spread of CWD.
Yeah, so if I understand what you're saying, one of the biggest tools for hunters to help out right now would be to buy some antlerless tags and participate in some antlerless hunts and take a few deer that they might not normally take if they're, traditionally buck hunters or trophy hunters.
Yeah, and the state wildlife agencies that are responsible for managing the deer need the support of hunters, to take actions that may appear drastic or counterproductive to, your goals as a deer hunter, but think about the long-term objective of what you want in terms of disease spread and the hunting tradition.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Dwayne, I definitely appreciate talking to you today. You had a lot of good insights, a lot of good information, and a lot of points that I think will be interesting to my listeners. Is there anything else that you'd like to touch on?
No, I'd just like to say that everything we've talked about today is sort of a side product or side benefit of my actual research. So my research, isn't really about deer movements or the rut or any of that stuff. I'm really focused on the research project is looking at how deer browsing, soil conditions, and competing vegetation composition of the forest vegetation influences the plant communities in our forests, with the objective of having healthy forests so that we can harvest trees, we can have sustainable populations of wildlife that depend on that forest, and also have a healthy deer herd. So that's the objective of my research, that we just nibbled at little bits and pieces of it, but the bulk of what we talked about was simply purely a side benefit that has nothing to do with the objectives of my research. So, and my research is supported by the Game Commission, which is supported primarily by sportsmen. So I hope folks recognize the value of research and that there's lots of unintended benefits of doing research. I guess I'd just like to point that out to your listeners. And also, we have a blog where we try and post something at least once a week about deer, usually focused related to the research project that we have. And I encourage people to go to deer.psu.edu and check that out. And I think they would, especially if you're a hunter, would find some interesting stuff there.
Yeah, that's how I first discovered you. And again, like you said, it's kind of a secondary benefit from your primary research, but there was a lot of things, at least to me, that were super interesting on the deer blog and the stuff that you guys are doing out in the field, the collar studies. And, you touched on it, the importance of your research to having a balanced forest plan, or I don't know if ecology is the right word, but overabundant deer populations definitely affect the plant life in a negative way. So again, going back to antlerless deer harvest and deer harvest in general, I mean, hunting, and I think you'll agree, or it's a fact, is the most important management tool there is out there. And we want to keep people active in hunting, and that's a big goal of my podcast, is to introduce people to hunting and to help people become better hunters. And I think that all works hand in hand to have, a healthy ecosystem.
Yeah, for sure. Hunting is the most important or the most effective tool in the wildlife deer manager's toolbox, and it would be a shame to lose that.
I agree. The tradition and what it would mean for wildlife in general. So, well, I want to thank you again, Dwayne, and I'm looking forward to getting this out to the listeners. Appreciate your time, and if I can talk to you again in the future here, maybe we'll get you on the line in a couple more months or next year.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. It was a lot of fun.
All right. Hey, take care.